Hey everybody, I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast where we're working our way through the book of Matthew in 10-ish minute chunks every day. If you've been hanging out with me since forever, making this a part of your morning or your workout or your commute or whatever, that is awesome. Thank you for doing that. I know there's a ton of things you could do with your time, so I really am genuinely honored that we get to spend time together 5 days a week like this. For those of you who are jumping in for the very first time ever, hey, welcome. I'm glad you're here. We're in Matthew chapter 10, which means that we're like 200 10-minute conversations plus into the book of Matthew, but you can just pick it up right here. It'll be fine. Or if it makes more sense for you, you get into it, it seems fun, you can just jump back in at the beginning whenever you want and play catch up. All right, how are we getting things started this time around? Shuffles deck, draws card, childhood memories. Here we go. When I was a kid, I got my first BMX bike, and it opened the whole world to me in terms of freedom. I lived in this little town. You can go wherever you want. It's the 80s. Everything's safe. And so the rule that my parents put in place for the summer is you just have to be home at sundown. Not at time, but just sundown. It worked really well because you can always see where the sun is. But then when I got to be 16, the sundown thing kind of went away, and it got replaced by, hey, if you're allowed to be out with your friends with a car tonight, we want you home by 10. Not 10:01. 10:01 is grounding, and boy, did they mean that. But then later, I became an adult, and I met a lady, and we got married, and we repeatedly made babies together, and then I got a job. Then I continue to be an adult who's dad and who's married, and even when I go to my parents' house, the rules still are the same for me. I can come home whenever I want, because I'm a big boy now. But you know what's crazy is that those are the same parents, right? Whether it's the kid version of me, the high school version of me, or even the I'm an adult and I'm going to visit my adult parents version of me. What gives with them changing the rules all the time? Doesn't that make them horribly inconsistent? Well, look, it's really easy to look at that situation and say, well, of course it doesn't make them horribly inconsistent. It makes them good parents who understood, developmentally appropriate boundaries for a kid. And if anything, common sense dictates that what might at first glance look like really inconsistent application of the rules from my parents over the years actually at second glance demonstrates how great they are as parents, how principled they were, and they were drawing on big picture principles to move things along with me. Likewise, when you pick up a Bible, you are dealing with effectively two characters. There's the God character, and again, whether you believe there's actually a God behind Christianity in the Bible or not, changes nothing about the text. The text holds itself out as having a God character and a bunch of human characters who come and go interchangeably in and out of the story, and they don't stay on screen for very long. It's like 1,500 years of writing and maybe thousands of years of history that's covered all around the world. So the humans function as more of a block or archetypes with a little bit of familiarity that we get with a few of the really major characters. So because you have these two characters together, and because history and humanity and the religion evolve over this time, God, who is unchanging according to the document, perfect in every way, never had to learn anything, completely has his business together, he is interacting with humans at different phases in the history of humanity, at different phases of them wrapping their brain around what the God character in the document is about. And so as a result, unsurprisingly, the God character has almost slightly different looking sets of ground rules at different points throughout the Bible. And just like you would look at my parents and say, well, that doesn't make my parents inconsistent. It makes them principled and able to apply their principles to multiple different situations as they parent a kid through childhood and into adulthood. So it is with God that it doesn't make him unprincipled or inconsistent or scattered. Instead, we see the consistent character of God throughout the whole text, Old Testament and New Testament. But it can get really tricky because if you're taking a scattershot look at the Bible, you're trying to just grab verses that make you feel better about things or that make for good lower back tattoos, you can get into some really weird stuff where you're like, well, this rule that God made here in Jeremiah, that is how he's going to act forever. And those are going to be the ground rules and the parameters for being a person who follows God forever, but they ain't. And then stuff changes and it can be really confusing. And unfortunately, that scattershot approach can cause the uncritical reader to be like, I don't know about this God character. Seems like he's all over the place, when in fact, he's utterly consistent. But we don't just see this spread out over the entire Bible. At times, we see this in individual passages. And knowing that God is held out as being unchanging, flawless, committed to the values and principles of the kingdom and of redemption and of his infallible perfection and his glory, and he never moves and all of that stuff, understanding that can help us to decode some passages that get a little bit tricky. That's a lot of warm-up to get us to where we're at today, which is Matthew chapter 10. Jesus is about to send out the 12 disciples on their big open world quest to go and tell people in the region about Jesus with the message, the kingdom of heaven is near, for the first time ever, and they're probably pretty freaked out about it. But this can be a bit of a confusing speech because verses 5 through 16, don't go among the Gentiles, or enter any town of the Samaritans. Go rather to the lost sheep of Israel. As you go, preach this message. The kingdom of heaven is near. Heal the sick, raise the dead, cleanse those who have leprosy, drive out demons. Freely you have received, freely give. Don't take anything along. Go into houses. If they're cool, hang around. If they're not, dust off your sandals. Keep going. I tell you, they ought to recognize me because I'm the real king. I'm sending you out like sheep among wolves. Therefore be as shrewd as snakes and as innocent as doves. And this is some paraphrasing in there. But it's that chunk that is clearly in the moment. Jesus is giving a set of ground rules for this quest, this moment. And so we read those 11 verses of the speech and we're like, okay, I'm tracking. This is a one-time event. Then maybe there's some kind of universal principles here, but this is what they can expect on this quest they're going on right now. But then you get into verse 17 and it gets weird. Let me read this to you. Be on your guard against men. They'll hand you over to the local councils and flog you in their synagogues. Wait, flogging? Let me just flip ahead here. Okay, so then they go out after Jesus finished giving the instructions. I'm in chapter 11. His 12 disciples went on from there to teach and preach in the towns of Galilee. Okay, that's what I would expect. And then verse 2, the very next one. When John heard in prison what Christ was doing, he sent his disciples. Wait. It doesn't sound like they got flogged at all. What's going on here? Well, what's going on here is a pivot in the scope of what Jesus is describing. So the first half, or maybe it would be better to say the first third of this speech that we've been looking at for the last week or so, is clearly in the moment. This is immediate. This is what you 12 guys can expect. And then as readers after the fact, we can look at that and learn a little bit about the character of Jesus, what he understands about himself, what he expects from those who hear about him, in the same way that you can look at my parents and learn a little bit about them by the fact that they let me ride my bike until sunset. I mean, even though that rule isn't still in effect for me, you look at that and you'd be like, oh, okay, well, those are parents who trusted their kid. It was probably a simpler time where maybe everybody felt a little bit safer. I bet they lived in a small community, and I bet they wanted that little tyke to learn a bit about responsibility. See how that works? Likewise, from this first chunk that isn't probably really directed at you or me or anybody but the 12 disciples he was speaking to in the first place, it isn't useless then. It's useful because we learn things about God and Jesus and his plan from it. It just doesn't look like it is a direct command for you or me or all people for all time. So you've got this thing that is called the Lesser Commission. We talked about it over the last 2 episodes, maybe 3. That's the I am sending you out like sheep among wolves, therefore be as shrewd as snakes and as innocent as doves, Matthew 10:16. This, I guess, could be compatible with another commissioning that Jesus gives in Matthew 28 at the very end of the gospel. This is the one about go and make disciples of all nations, and we'll get there someday, years and years and years from now. So maybe they're compatible. Maybe there's some universality to this shrewdness instruction, but the rest of it looks like these are ground rules for the moment. But then we get to the stuff about the flogging and everything. We realize that they don't go out on this road trip and get flogged. I mean, it looks like really not much happens. Maybe some people believe. I mean, the feedback we get from Matthew, again in verse 1 of chapter 11, is that they went out and they taught and preached in the towns of Galilee. There's no comment on the results in Matthew, which gives us some insight into what the author is going for. These details were not here. This trip maybe wasn't even totally about how many people can we get to sign up, always be closing. It looks like the trip was maybe more about the 12 guys Jesus was sending out and the experience and the getting started on this thing that was going to define their entire lives, because Jesus is going to hand off responsibility in an earthly sense for the church after he is gone. So then starting in verse 17, the ground rules are changing. The parameters are changing. Now we're getting to the driver's license and you can stay out till 10 o'clock time. Again, be on your guard against men. They'll hand you over to the local councils and flog you in their synagogues. On my account, you'll be brought before governors and kings as witnesses to them and to Gentiles. But when they arrest you, don't worry about what to say or how to say it. At that time, you'll be given what to say, for it will not be you speaking, but the Spirit of your Father speaking through you. And then there's a whole bunch more, and we got to break all of that down. What I wanted to accomplish today, though, was not breaking down the next chunk of this speech, but rather framing it so that as we start to interpret it together, we're reading it for what it is. A shift in ground rules. Jesus is changing his focus from the first part of the instructions that deal with the immediate trip to a more mid-range view of what these specific disciples were going to experience. All these things that are in the list I just read you, they happen to these people. They just happen later. They happen in the book of Acts. They happen after the Bible wraps up. And clearly Jesus didn't get this wrong. And even if Jesus did get it wrong, Matthew, who is obviously trying to make Jesus look good and credible, would not have put it in the document and said, yeah, Jesus told him this and then it didn't happen. It makes Jesus look stupid if we try to read this as though everything in Matthew chapter 10 that is in this commissioning speech is about the immediate trip that the disciples are on. No. Instead, it is crystal clear that Matthew, Jesus, the original audience, the disciples themselves were able to track with Jesus' logical movements here. First, much like the you got your first BMX bike, be home at sunset rules, Jesus is going to talk about the parameters of this immediate trip. Second, much like the I just got my driver's license, now I have to be home by 10, not 10:01 set of ground rules, Jesus is going to talk about the parameters of the larger extent of the rest of their lives and what these 12 men are going to experience as they get on with it. And then third, we're going to talk about a different set of ground rules that gets hinted at and described that maybe even goes beyond the lifetimes of what these 12 men should expect. I hope that that little framing out sets you and I up for success as we process this out together in the coming days and on into next week. Simply put, my parents changed and reframed for me the ground rules as I grew up. Likewise, in this speech, Jesus is changing and reframing for his disciples how the ground rules are going to unfold as they grow up in their relationship with him and in their new purposes in life, which is to be representatives of this kingdom, even though, according to this text, that is going to be a bit uncomfortable for them at times. And by a bit uncomfortable, I mean flayed alive. I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast. Let's do this again soon.